I'm here with Michael Bess, Professor Michael Bess, I should say, from the University of the Vanderbilt University in Nashville. Michael, you are in Nashville at the moment, but can you introduce yourself to the listeners and viewers of this interview?
Well, hello there. You want me to say more about who I am?
Yeah, that's that would be nice.
Well, I'm a history professor at Vanderbilt. I specialize in 20th and 21st century European history. And over the past, I'd say 15 years, I've always been interested in the relations between technology and society, how they influence each other. Over the past 15 years, I've become more and more interested in the future, sort of drawing dotted lines from present day trends and trying to see where they're pointing and listening to what the experts are saying about where those dotted lines are pointing. And so I've been trying to learn a lot more science over the past 10 or 15 years, and that's been very rewarding and exciting. And I've tried to get a sense of where science and technology seem to be taking our society and how much of a say we can have in shaping that process. So that's really, I've started teaching classes about that. Whenever I want to learn something new, I teach a class about it, and then I learn with my students.
Yeah, what for me is quite interesting is that you are teaching, of course, at an American university, but you were a teacher, or you're also teaching European history right now. Is that correct?
Yes, my mother was Italian. I've spent a lot of time, my first language actually was Italian before I learned English. I grew up in this country, but I spent a lot of time in Italy. I have relatives in Italy, and I've spent a lot of time in France because I fell in love with France and spent a lot of time working on the French history and various aspects of French history. I wrote a book about the environmental movement in France.
All right, and you also explained the transition you made from history to the future, as you might say. Was there also one key moment that you were intrigued by writing and investigating the future, as you might say?
I'd say that the real catalyst for me was back in the early 1980s, the show Star Trek: The Next Generation, which is sort of the second series of Star Trek. It has the Captain Jean-Luc Picard, and on the ship there is an android named Commander Data. And that image of an android, a machine that makes you feel as though you're interacting with a person, completely captured my imagination. And I started asking myself, could such a thing be actually possible and not just science fiction? And so that started motivating me to write and to read books about, well, what is it that makes us human? What makes us special? What makes us different from animals? What makes us different from the most advanced forms of machines and AI? And so that became sort of a direction for me. And after a while, I then I started to realize, probably before we actually succeed at building an android that makes us feel like it's human or a person, before that happens, we will probably modify ourselves in ways that are using biotechnology, various forms, to make ourselves more powerful in a variety of ways. And so I then started getting very interested in that. And what's common to all this is a convergence between humans and machines. The machines becoming more person-like, and the persons using biotechnology in ways that render them alterable in the same ways that we alter and shape our machines. So not necessarily becoming more machine-like, but becoming alterable in certain powerful ways. And there's a convergence there, the sort of using artificial means to build these very powerful new forms of personhood.
Yeah, so technology is getting more into biology and biology is getting more into technology.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I was, for the people that are listening or watching, I read this book from you. I think in Europe it's the name Make Way for the Superhumans, and I think in the States it has another name, right?
Yes, in the States it's Our Grandchildren Redesigned. When the British edition for the UK territories in Europe, they chose that title, which is even more explicit in talking about superhumans.
Yes, yes. And for me, it was one of the first books which really gets into the concept of bioenhancing. And my first question actually about this topic is, do you think our path to bioenhancement is inevitable?
I have a strong view on that. On many of these questions, I don't have strong views one way or the other. I've become more and more humble as the years have gone by, and I realize how little I actually know. On the question of inevitability, I've become more and more firmly convinced that nothing is inevitable except maybe the heat death of the universe. And that everything I've ever learned about history shows me that there is a space for human agency. It's a limited space. It's, we don't have the kind of control necessarily that we aspire to in shaping history, but there is a definite space in which human decisions make a difference. And there can be individual choices, or they can be eventually flowering out into collective choices. And some of those can be shaped. In fact, the collective choices can in fact be shaped by individuals who articulate values in a way that spreads through the culture. And I lived through a very powerful example of that in 1989. I had just been working for 4 years on a doctoral dissertation at my alma mater, University of California at Berkeley. This was my PhD dissertation. And I had become convinced by all my readings that the Cold War was here to stay for the long haul. I had political science professors, very eminent. One of them, Kenneth Waltz, had written all kinds of books and was very influential. And he basically said the Cold War is here to stay because it's a structural factor in world history. It's a superposition of an ideological and a geopolitical rivalry between these two superpowers, and that makes it very stable. And it's going to be very hard for that to go away anytime soon. And I uncritically, I thought about it, and then I was persuaded by this. And just as I'd finished my dissertation, I came to Vanderbilt for my first year of teaching, and that was in August of 1989. And by December of 1989, my entire premise of my dissertation had been proven false.
Yes.
I had to, and so I just watched all these giant structures that I had been studying for the preceding decade just come fluidly unraveled, partly because of very large structural factors in world politics, but also because of the actions of individuals like Mikhail Gorbachev, Václav Havel in the Czech Republic, people who had been struggling to, get a grip on the levers of change, and then all of a sudden the thing flowered out and became a massive change that has, completely rewritten what we know about Europe, about contemporary Europe. With that sort of example in mind, and I can cite many more throughout history, it's become I'm very convinced that, in fact, history is much more fluid than some people tend to think.
Yeah, that was, I think, one of the strong points of your book, because you are, as I might say, a historian, which is writing about the future. So it's much more illustrated with these kinds of examples, which I really liked. And I also like the premise that we are still able to influence our future by ourselves.
Yeah. And you know what, like I say, it's a limited influence, but it's real.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's an interesting process too, because we, as individuals, we can influence the larger structures and patterns in the culture in our society. And then that in turn becomes the new milieu in which we live. So there's a circular process, or I guess a sort of a rebound effect that is inherent in this. We are sort of the makers and the objects of our own history at the same time. It's a fascinating interplay, whole and part.
Yeah. And I think we'll get back to this subject later in our interview.
Okay.
Can you elaborate on some of the developments that are the main drivers in human enhancement? For example, pharmaceuticals, genetics, bioelectronics, etc.
Sure. I would say the pharmaceutical category, we've been already doing that for a long time. Millennia, if you want to include herbal, methods. But powerful pharmaceuticals, in the past century, and accelerating since World War II. And what's the trend that I see happening with the pharmaceuticals is they'll become more precise as we understand more and more about the biochemistry of the brain and the functional architecture of the brain and of the body, and how the brain works with the body and the hormones and all that. So they'll become more precise as instruments, and they'll have fewer side effects. And I think that's going to be a very powerful trend over the next 20, 40, 50 years. We're going to be able, perhaps, to use pharmaceuticals in ways that allow us to get quick and very fine-grained, precise effects in alterations of various aspects of how we function, mentally, physically. And then be able to change that, erase that effect equally quickly. So kind of like you imagine the cockpit of a 747 with all those controls, and except that the controls now are chemical, and you're sort of playing on this very complex instrument panel, running your own biochemistry at a much more fine-grained level. Now that's an exaggerated image, obviously, but that's the sort of trend that I see happening today.
Yes, and sorry, another application, of course, of altering your states and emotions would also be to directly influence the brain with electronics, which also that's I think most close to the development you talked about, becoming the symbiosis of man and machine.
Yes. And in a way, we have a very clear sense of what that's like already because of what's happened with, cell phones over the past decade, let's say, or even 20 years, if we want to go back even further. They started out as portable telephones, and now they're portable computers that allow you to be constantly networked with people everywhere and with the infosphere. And as a result, I'm looking at, so I see sort of two trends among young people. I see that people get angry with me because they say, I called you on your cell phone and you didn't answer. And I say, well, I left it downstairs. And they look at me incredulously and say, how could you leave it downstairs? People carry them with them at all times. And I'm sure they're going to actually invent, ways to carry them into the shower with them or into the swimming pool so that they never have to be separate from this machine that connects them to everybody. And I also see some awareness among young people that this can go too far, that there's such a thing as too much connectedness, that there's such a thing as paying too much attention to how many likes you got or how many clicks you got, and becoming kind of a slave to some of the social media that these machines enable. And I'm glad to see that. And one of the frustrating things for me about going around the Vanderbilt campus in between classes is the sidewalks are quiet when classes are in session, and then at the end of the hour, suddenly all the classrooms open up and all the students go to their next class, and the sidewalks are all full. 90% of the people are looking at their cell phones as they walk. and kind of somehow mysteriously avoiding collisions with each other. But it's a beautiful day, the sun is out, the trees, it's a very beautiful campus, the Vanderbilt campus, and everybody is glued to their screens. And I've sat in on, when these technologies, laptop computers and things like that first became widespread, we educators, we professors, we thought, well, this is going to be great. We'll integrate them into our classroom teaching, and this will give the power of the web to our teaching. It'll augment our teaching. It'll be an enhancement. And it was the opposite of an enhancement. It destroyed the interaction, the face-to-face interaction in the classroom. If I'm sitting at a table with 15 students and they all have their laptops up, it's like I'm looking at a wall. And if I'm sitting in a lecture hall, I've gone in and sat in on excellent lectures by colleagues of mine. And if you stand at the back, sit at the very back of the lecture hall and look at the professor over the heads of these students, and you see they're all on their laptops, and 50–70% of them are paying attention to what's going on in their laptops and sort of occasionally checking in with the professor. And I hate that. So I banned cell phones and laptops from my classroom, because I want to have, eye contact and interaction. And if you're going to bother to come and be present face to face, let's use the advantages of that and not let these machines get in the way of it. It's a good example of how a supposedly powerful new technology can do the opposite of what you think it's going to do.
And I think that's also a trend you see in history, where people or companies or governments or other people are inventing things with a certain purpose, but don't know for sure how things are going to play out in the long run. Yeah,
unintended effects are, that's a subject that really interests me. I want to write a book about it, actually, at some point, somewhere out there, one of the books that I'd love to write, because it'd be fun to go through history and just pick out major instances of society does something and then something very different happens as a side effect that's even more momentous. A good example, World War I, all the men get drafted, and suddenly the women have to go into the factories. And it completely changes the way women see themselves. The war is over, the men come back home, and the women, many, many women have experienced themselves in a whole new way. And suddenly their expectations, it's no longer just a private sphere, it's no longer just living in the home and, cooking and so forth and raising the kids. It's, hey, I can do this too, I can have a public. So the impact is tremendous, and it's totally unintended. It's just a side effect. Fascinating.
Yeah, maybe for that book, I also have a story for you,
yeah.
which I use, and it's also related to bioelectronics. There's a case in the Netherlands, where a patient was suffering from Parkinson's disease.
Yeah.
So he got a treatment with deep brain stimulation, and it helped him with his symptoms, but at the same time, he developed into another character. So he was very shy and introvert, and then the DBS started, and he became extrovert. He started cheating on his wife. He started stealing things. And the moment treatment stopped, he became his old personality again.
Right. Yeah, and that's the fact that we can do that with electrical stimulation in the brain should lead us to be extremely cautious in how we proceed with bioelectronic enhancement. They're making some amazing machines. I haven't seen them a lot in practical application yet, but for example, direct current stimulation here, for if you do that while you're working on maybe playing the piano or learning how to play a aircraft piloting simulation. The Air Force is apparently using direct current transcranial stimulation here. It helps you learn faster and retain more quickly what you've learned. And they don't know exactly how it works, but they know that it does. And you see that, and then you wonder, well, what else is happening? Just like you just said. There's a graduate student here at Vanderbilt who wrote a dissertation on deep brain stimulation, and he worked with a lot of these patients. And it was fascinating to hear his analysis of how they perceive themselves differently as a result of having become part cyborg.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe we get into that later in the interview. Also,
Sure.
talking about ownership and all types of marketing on modification, etc. I also want to touch on some interesting points which I learned from your book, because in Europe and I also think in the States there's a lot of debate about designer babies and
Right.
modifying embryos, etc. And you introduced to me the term epigenetic programming. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. When I first heard about designer babies, and many of the movies and sci-fi novels about designer babies all assume that you're going to be altering people's DNA in order to get precise trait outcomes, alterations. But if you're going to alter DNA and you have to have it propagate through all the cells in the body, you have to do it right at the moment of conception or very shortly after the moment of conception, when you have a little blastula, and then the modification stays in every cell, which means that it would have to be parents doing it to their kids at the moment of conception. And that creates a big problem. The German philosopher Jürgen Habermas has written extensively about that. You'd become sort of an artifact in the hands of your parents, and it would constrain your ability to really be who you are. And already our parents have a tremendous power to shape who we become. But that's an environmental, nurturing form of shaping. This would extend parental shaping to a whole new level. And Habermas does a really good job of elaborating why this is an encroachment on the autonomy of the autonomous development of an individual. So that's a big moral problem with designer babies. And what I found out over the past 10 years, there's a new field that's growing in influence. The scientists are very excited about it, called epigenetics. And the metaphor for epigenetics that I use is the piano keyboard. If your DNA is the piano keyboard with all the different black and white keys that you can hit, that's your DNA. That's always present in every cell. But when the pianist is playing on the piano, not all the keys are hit at the same time. Only certain melodies and rhythms are hit. And you get one song if you hit a certain pattern, and you get a different song if you hit a different pattern. Well, it turns out that our DNA is being played in that way every second that we're alive by another instrument, which is the epigenome. And these are the mechanisms that activate or deactivate, turn up or turn down the expression of DNA. DNA, in order to be causally efficacious, in order to have an impact, has to be expressed. But not all of it is being expressed at the same time. So it's constantly being selectively expressed. And that's your epigenome, or epigenetics is the study of how these molecular mechanisms cause the turning up or the turning down of expression of our 22,000 genes in myriad patterns and sequences that allow us to adapt moment by moment. You step into a sauna, there's an epigenetic process that allows your body to maintain temperature homeostasis and not overheat. You start sweating. That's epigenetically mediated, as well as other systems as well. So here's a system, a whole layer of controls over your DNA that is accessible to us throughout our lives. So as a means of creating designer humans, you're no longer talking about designer babies. You can wait until somebody is 21 years old, and whatever the age of adulthood is in your country, and then say, now, as a sovereign adult, you can make decisions about how you want to play on that keyboard. What do you want to turn up? What do you want to turn down? And so, in a sense, you're as an adult making decisions about how you want to modify the expression of your own genome. how your genome influences your traits. And of course, that's a very complicated process, a constant interaction between genome and environment, nature and nurture, in a constant perpetual dance together, a symphony of interactions. But if we learn how to modify that in predictable ways, and that's exactly what scientists are now figuring out with the science of epigenetics, this would be a powerful tool for modifying the genetic component of what makes us who we are.
Yeah, that's interesting. And maybe also if you combine it with, in the future, artificial intelligence, for example. So you want to obtain a certain goal in your epigenetics, and then use artificial intelligence program to make the perfect formula for you, in a way.
Yes. I suspect that in the future, AI will play a big role in, well, basically all these technologies, because AI is getting better at problem solving certain kinds of problems than humans.
Yeah, and that's a nice segue to my next question, because you also wrote about a couple of so-called wildcards, like nanotech, artificial intelligence, and also synthetic biology, as
Yes.
I can remember. What kind of things surprised you the most?
Well, I'll tell you, I was planning on writing my next book about a broader question about what makes us human, but the more I read about AI, after finishing this book about bioenhancement, I started reading a lot about AI. Nick Bostrom's book, Superintelligence, was a real milestone for me to read that. And it really made my hair stand on end, literally. I've never been so frightened by a book. I said to myself, I need to learn more about this, because it seems like we're creating something far more powerful than any other instrument that we've ever made. And so my path as a writer and scholar deviated, and I wrote a different book. I just finished writing, the past 2 years, I've been frantically writing a different book. I took the question of how to control AI, advanced AI, and where it's going to go, and what kind of machines we're going to make. And I embedded it in a deeper question of how you control very powerful technologies that can be used for good or for ill, what they call dual use technologies, because they can be very beneficial or very harmful. And so the title of this book that I've just finished, I'm going to be sending it off to publishers in the next month or so. The title is Controlling the Technologies of Apocalypse: Nuclear, Nanotech, Synthetic Biology, AI. So I'm talking about these 4 technologies, radical game changers, very, very powerful in their effects, negative or positive. And the question that I ask in the book is, how do we use these technologies wisely? How do we maximize the benefits, minimize the risks? And so that was a detour that talk about unexpected, unintended effects. I totally didn't expect to be writing that book, and suddenly, 2 years went into it because I felt it was a more pressing priority. And since then, a lot of public figures like Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking, even Bill Gates have come out and said, this may be the best thing or the worst thing that humankind ever creates.
Yeah, my recent book that I read about the topic was Life 3.0 from Max Tegmark.
It's a wonderful book. I love that book.
But I'm also looking forward to your book. But I was wondering, because you talked about the apocalypse and nanotech, AI, and synthetic, but you did not mention the superhuman as a threat.
Yeah, it could be. I guess when I'm thinking of apocalypse, I'm thinking. I think the superhuman apocalypse would be one where we become something we didn't intend to be. It's not the same thing as blowing ourselves up. The apocalypse that I'm talking about with nuclear, nanotech, synthetic biology, and AI would be a very rapid, like a nuclear war. In the case of nanotechnology, it would be the gray goose scenario, even though I don't know if your listeners are familiar with the gray goo scenario. It's since been discredited, and it's probably the least likely of the apocalyptic scenarios that I consider, but it's still a theoretical possibility. And the idea is if you're building very small nanomachines that can self-replicate, you get the problem of the sorcerer's apprentice. What if they start becoming omnivorous and can transform everything in their environment into more copies of themselves? You get the entire planet engulfed by small self-replicating nanomachines, and the world turns into a pile of quivering gray goo. That was very alarming when I first read about it 20 years ago, but since then scientists have sort of studied it, and they say as long as you don't build nanomachines that are self-replicating, that's not a problem. This synthetic biology is worrisome because it'd be a sudden event. Again, it'd be a pandemic. Biological organisms are precisely designed to self-replicate. They do naturally what we're having a very hard time getting nanomachines to do, which is to make more copies of themselves using the resources in the environment. So now imagine that amateur scientists with insufficient training start to engineer microbes and make alterations, all well-intentioned, let's say, not necessarily a bioweapon, not necessarily bad people trying to do bad things, but well-intentioned people just making an oops mistake that unleashes a super microbe that goes out there and does a pandemic worse than the 1919 pandemic that killed between 20 and 50 million people around the world. The influenza of 1919 killed more people than World War I. That's a worry, because synthetic biology is, it's also known now as do-it-yourself biology, biohacking, biopunk. People are doing it in their kitchens, in their garages, and there's a movement to render this democratized. And there's no control. As long as you're not trying to sell products, as long as you're not, trying explicitly stating your intention to create a very dangerous pathogen, nobody controls what you do. And one of the things I explore is how we need to regulate that type of biology research. And AI, what really worries me about AI, once again, it's not subtle. It's very straightforward. When AI reaches human level, becomes as dexterous and capable to manipulate the world and as intelligent as a human being, it's also going to be able to use those powers to modify itself, to reprogram itself, to enhance its own internal, quote unquote, mental functioning, its own software. It's going to be able to redesign its own hardware to make itself more potent. And you can do that, and once it's done that once, it'll use its augmented mental and physical powers to do it again and become even more mentally, physically powerful. And that's a recursive process that very quickly can become, if not exponential, it can certainly expand very rapidly. You can get a machine that sort of becomes a runaway AI. And there are various terms for this in the literature. Intelligence explosion is one of the terms that gets used. And that worries me. It worries me because our society is putting a lot of resources into building human level AI. And not a lot of resources into figuring out how to control human level AI so that it remains a tool, something that we can put to certain purposes and not to other purposes, and not an entity that is off and running and following purposes of its own. We're not investing a lot of resources into that, and the people who are actually spending a lot of time studying that at this point are few and far between compared to the tremendous resources that we're putting into making them ever more powerful. And depending on whom you listen to, this could be 30 years away, 50 years away. 70 years away. But any way you look at it, this would be an inflection point in history when such machines become prevalent. And God knows what they'll do when they network with each other. And you get even further levels of complexity and power. I think we need to start preparing for that today before those machines are an imminent possibility. Today, they're still over the horizon, but we're working very hard to build them. And I think we need to start putting precautionary steps in place now before they're built.
Yes, and also concerning the do-it-yourself biology, I'm a biohacker as well, and not like other examples like Josiah Zehner, for example. But don't you think that the real threat of superhumans or artificial intelligence comes from warfare? For example, having the super soldiers or these kinds of developments?
Yes, I think military research, military applications are they're gonna drive this. AI, you can be sure that military organizations are investing heavily on AI, because through AI you can control all the other weapons. You can hack the systems, the communication systems. Whoever has the more powerful AI has, in a sense, a way to exert a meta level of control over the other people's resources. So AI is going to be the weapon of choice in the future. Super soldiers don't concern me as much. I think we're likely to see the armies of the future be clouds, swarms of micro drones. When you see what they can do with drone technology today, it's mind-blowing. These little swarms that are all can fly in configuration. And you just imagine machines like that equipped with batteries that allow them to travel for half a day without recharging, all maybe swarms of them the size of a bumblebee, and they can inject you with either something that puts you to sleep or that kills you or that makes you go crazy. And you can bat away 20 of them and 50 more come in and get you. That's more effective than any super soldier climbing around in boots and a gun, and even if they're super augmented and have X-ray vision and all that stuff. A cloud of micro drones can take over a territory and control the humans in that territory more effectively than anything. I suspect drones are going to be the instrument of choice for actual weaponry, deployment to a territory, for control of territory in the future.
And I was wondering, because my next question was about science fiction, because you coined the term Jetson fallacy, which I really liked.
Yeah.
But concerning the drones, did you also see the Black Mirror episode, which was inspired on that scenario?
No.
It's Black Mirror. It's a Netflix series.
I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, I think third or fourth season, the last episode is, it's really great about what you told. So.
Oh, really? Oh, well, check it out. That's one of the things that's cool is there are a lot of people thinking about this and envisioning, and you get these kinds of ideas popping up here and there all over the place.
Yeah,
and I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, that's. I will send you the link of the episode after the interview. But I was wondering, can you explain the Jetson fallacy?
It's very simple. Back in I believe it was 1962, there was a very popular show called The Flintstones, which imagined American nuclear family back in time, in the time of the dinosaurs. And it was so successful that they made another one where they imagined 100 years into the future, it's going to be the year 2062. And they tried to imagine what the world would be like. And so you have flying cars and cars that fold up into a briefcase, and you have robots that serve you in various ways. And it's all this advanced technology that surrounds people, but the people themselves are exactly the same in 2062 as they were in 1962. And the family structure is the same. The woman still is a sort of subservient 1950s housewife. So all the societal changes and all the technological changes have sort of been erased, and you have this transposition of 100 years into the future, unchanged 1962 humans. Whereas what's far more likely is that we're going to start modifying ourselves over the coming decades in using all these powerful instruments. We're already profoundly different people from who we were back in 1962. And we've only just begun with the biotechnologies, but just the cultural change has been tremendous. I mean, you watch those shows and it makes you laugh out loud at how dated they are in some ways. We're sort of only halfway through that, through that process of change. Now imagine what happens when you apply all the biotechnologies. So I call it the Jetson's fallacy because it's the assumption that all of our technology that surrounds us will change, but we won't. And I think that's a fallacy.
And do you have like favorite science fiction books, movies or series which do not fall in the trap of the Jetson fallacy?
It's hard to think of examples. So one example that I give in the book of one that appears to get out of the Jetson's fallacy but doesn't is a popular movie called Gattaca. It envisions a world of genetically modified superhumans, but it's a two-tiered world. There's the upper class who have been genetically modified, and then there's the lower class who are not genetically modified. And the story is one of the guys from the underclass wants to become an astronaut and go out into space. And so he pretends to become he uses various means to defeat the detection technologies. And so he trains himself to operate at the level of the upper class genetically modified people. So the movie is saying, wouldn't it be awful if there's a society where we're all divided into two tiers and those are determined by genetic technology? That's the message of the movie. But what it also said to me was it's back into the Jetson's fallacy, because you're implying that genetically unmodified humans could rise up and perform at the level of genetically modified humans and pretend to be one of them successfully and pull off that deception. Whereas in fact, the difference is going to be so far apart that genetically modified humans will run circles around genetically non-modified humans. And in that sense, it's still stuck in imagining a world that's kind of too similar to the world of today. This is going to be a radically different world, because you imagine what it's going to be like when they're using pharmaceuticals, bioelectronics, genetics, and epigenetics all at once. And different groups of people choosing different concoctions and coordinations and packages of these technologies in all manner of different ways. We're talking about a world where people become radically different from the way they are today. If you encounter one of these people walking down the sidewalk toward you, it makes your hair stand on end because you say, my God, what is this being who has just appeared in front of me? A former human who has now become something new.
And I think, because, let me start over. Do you think it will lead into different classes of humans? Like you mentioned a couple of enclaves, like the Amish, for example. So you have the modified and the non-modified. Or do you also see like the book Homo Deus from Harari, that you really have like superhumans and normal humans?
Yes, one of the immediate worries is the same one that was expressed in the film Gattaca, which is you get a two-tiered society, a sort of caste system determined by access to these bioenhancement technologies or no access. And that is something I do worry about very much, because it's clear that rich people are going to have first access and best access to these technologies. Many of these technologies are going to be expensive, especially at the beginning. Cell phones started out very expensive, and now everyone can own, almost everyone. They're spreading all over the world. Maybe they'll get cheaper, and eventually that may democratize this a little bit. But one of the things I worry about is a two-tiered system where some people, imagine parts of the world where people don't have access to clean water, when they're fighting malaria, when they have very poor educational systems and they're half starved half the time. They're going to be the last to get access to these bioenhancement technologies that are going to be available in the more industrialized, wealthy countries. And we're talking about billions of people. So on a global scale, it's very worrisome you end up with a two-tiered humankind. Another kind of fragmentation that I worry about is even within wealthy societies where everyone has more or less access to these technologies, or even if you manage to create a sort of global subsidizing plan, sort of like you have in Holland with, free public health, free education for everybody, for every citizen. Even if you can do that on a global scale, you still could get clusters forming of people who get modified according to certain tastes, let's say. So for example, you can imagine two musicians who decide to have a kid, and they want to have a kid who can appreciate music as much as they do. So they go down that path of enhancing the particular traits that make one a good musician. Manual dexterity, the parts of the brain that are important for processing music and hearing, and they get they create a child who is far more given to having tremendous prowess in music, and at the same time socially, of course, they're connecting with other people who are doing the same thing, and not paying so much attention to the people who are trying to produce offspring who are fantastic tennis players, mathematicians, physicists, whatever it may be. And what I see there is a sort of social clustering effect of these enhancements forming social groups that each tends to sort of snowball in different directions, and a lateral fragmentation. It's no longer the vertical haves and have-nots. Everybody has access, but they're choosing, because of their basic predilections at the beginning, to go in certain directions with their enhancements that then feed off of themselves and lead to social clustering. And this could lead to a form of tribalism. Tribalism is something that goes very deep into the human constitution. It seems to be rooted in our ancestors, going back into the time of the savannah, very far back. Part of sort of our behavioral genetics, part of our evolutionary biology. Tribalism, us versus them, is a very basic constituent that's made humans what they're like, what they are. This could be a new form of tribalism taking place in a technologically advanced society, but still a fragmentation. And it's possible to imagine hostility developing, rivalries developing among these increasingly distinct and divergent groups. And that's worrisome.
Yes, I agree, but that still comes from a basis or a premise that upgrades are an individual choice. Do you think it's also a possible path where governments, for example, like in the book Brave New World, decide for their people to upgrade them in any way, or alter them in any way, I should say?
Well, I doubt that maybe in a place like North Korea, you can force people to adopt certain enhancements that the government has chosen, quote unquote, for the good of everybody. In democratically run societies, I think that's not going to be an issue. But what's more concerning is, let's say that you do have poor people and rich people, and you want to give everyone access, equal access, so that they have a choice. Don't modify yourself, but here we'll help you pay for it because we know it's expensive. So in order to get equality, you have to get governments to subsidize it. Are governments going to subsidize me if I decide that I want to add a prehensile monkey tail to myself? Probably not. they'll say, no, that's a stupid waste of resources. You don't need a prehensile tail. I said, well, I want one. Well, then you have to pay for that yourself. We won't subsidize it. What's implicitly happening there is the government is setting certain standards in how it subsidizes access to the technologies. And that is in itself a form of top-down eugenics.
Yes,
so the government would be shaping the population simply by what it's not allowing and what it's choosing to pay for.
Yes, in your book, which I really liked, you also make the case that it's probable that the governments will have a sort of welfare system for these bio-enhancements, because you also make a scenario, if they're not doing it, it will cause riots between the modified and the non-modified.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting example, because it also brings me the question, which is getting more and more relevant, I think. Who decides what you can do it and how you can do it and when you want to do it and in what way?
Right, and I totally agree. The who decides is a very difficult question. Ultimately, I think it can't be the government deciding. It has to be individuals deciding for themselves, parents deciding on behalf of their children, which has its own ethical problems, as I mentioned earlier. But even if you devolve the decision down to individual citizens and families, you still get problems. You're going to get some people who are going to be making modifications that might be dangerous to other people. You can imagine, for example, bioelectronic implants that jam or fry the bioelectronic implants of other people. Well, you can't allow that. So there's inevitably going to be some controls and some restrictions have to be imposed at the level of government. And so the who decides, another problem with who decides, if you have individuals making decisions separately for themselves, and you look at how individuals make those decisions today, there you get the phenomenon that we call fads. So, but imagine fads applied to genetic choices. And so the sort of jokingly in the book, I say you could get the musical 70s, the blonde 90s. You get periods of time when something is very popular and then that passes and then a new wave comes and a new set of traits becomes popular and oh, I got to go get that. And everyone runs to get it because we are, once again, sort of like sheep. We run toward what everybody else is doing. We're heavily influenced by what we see other people adopting or not adopting. And who decides? Well, it's hard for me to resist it if everyone around me is doing it. You have to take a very strong stand and make decisions for yourself, which is what I think is going to be one of the crucial characteristics that citizens have to take responsibility for nurturing inside themselves in this coming era, if we're going to survive this without it becoming a form of apocalypse, like you were saying earlier. And what I say is in the book is we're going to have to, each of us, become very clear about what it means for a human being to flourish. We're going to need to decide for ourselves, what are the things that really bring meaning into my life? What are the things that really matter? What are my deepest values? And then every time that you're offered some form of bioenhancement, you have to ask yourself, measuring it against that yardstick of human flourishing and your own values, integrate it into the totality of my life. If I do this, what do I gain and what do I lose? Because inevitably there will be trade-offs in almost every case. If we're critical, if we train ourselves to be critical and think carefully about the impact that these technologies have, and about the possible unintended effects that they may have, not just for ourselves, but when millions of people adopt them at the same time. I think we're better equipped then to stay true to what makes our lives meaningful through this process. Otherwise, it's possible that this is just sort of becomes a headlong rush into who knows what, a dehumanization that's once again very worrisome.
And yeah, that was actually my question. Do you worry that that path is going to play out in the long run?
I do worry because I do believe in that humans have a choice, and what it means to have a choice is to also make bad choices. We can take harmful paths that actually take us away from what brings meaning into our lives, and that's just as real a possibility as paths that augment and enrich our lives. Every one of us is responsible in that way for the choices that we make. Already today, that's forgetting about bioenhancement, that's something that's real for us. But with these powerful new technologies, we have to take responsibility for that at a whole new level, I think.
And besides critical thinking and considering your human values, are there other ways in which we can influence these developments in the coming years?
I don't know any instrument except the instrument. When I say critical thinking, it also means thinking together with other people. I, for example, have been profoundly influenced by the writings of a Kentucky farmer named Wendell Berry. He's written poems, novels, essays over the span of the last 30 or 40 years. And I can't recommend his works highly enough. When I want to get a sense of someone who is looking very intelligently at the technological changes that are coming upon our world, he's doing it through the lens of agriculture particularly, but also what's happening to our bodies and minds, our relationship to technology. He strikes me as one of the more humane and insightful observers of this phenomenon, and he has chosen certain forms of renunciation and voluntary simplicity, kind of like I had to do with laptops in my classroom. Saying no selectively to certain technologies, saying yes to others, but constraining their use so that they stay tuned to making your life richer and more meaningful, so that they are in alignment with your values. And he's extraordinarily good at applying that question again and again in all different aspects of how he lives his life. He's an extraordinary, I've also had the good fortune to meet him and talk to him, an extraordinary human being. So I can't recommend his books highly enough. Just almost anything that you go and get from Wendell Berry is magical.
I will add, excuse me, I will add it to the show notes.
Good.
So, we're coming up to the last part of the interview.
Okay.
You wrote a book about bioenhancement as superhumans. If you can upgrade yourself in any way, what would you choose? I guess there are two pathways that I see for enhancing oneself. One is technological and one is not technological. Of the two, for me, the most important one has been non-technological. Every morning for 20 minutes, I practice meditation. That has had a profound impact on who I am, how I live the hours of my day. It ripples out through the rest of the day. And for me, it's a tool, in a sense. It's an instrument that I have adopted. It's a technique that I have adopted. I've integrated it into my daily life. And it's allowed me to become more developed along certain values that matter a lot to me. Humility, gratitude, kindness, love. These are real enhancements. I feel so much more alive and I feel so enhanced as a person because of a 20-minute sitting on a bench and watching my own heart and mind process. Nothing technological about it at all. And I want to emphasize that because too often we're looking for fixes
we're trained to think, well, here's a problem, let's build a machine to fix the problem. This is a good example how you can augment yourself without looking outside at all. No machine, you're looking inside. Now you're using a technique, you're using an instrument. It happens to be a 3,000-year-old instrument that has been developed by many different societies, and millions of different types of meditation that you can do, but it's an extraordinarily powerful one. If you ask me, well, no, but what technology would you use? I would probably go for an enhancement that gave me increased health span. Not just lifespan, but quality of life. I'm 63 years old. My body is starting to break down. I don't like it. And I'm not eager to leave this plane of existence. And so if I could live another, an extra 30 or 40 years, I'm also extremely curious to see what's going to happen. So I want to find out how all my books that I've written about the future are wrong.
Just like your dissertation was wrong in the end.
Exactly. Learning to see where you're wrong is a very powerful way to learn. And so if I could have an increased health span, that would be the simplest form of, obviously it's a very basic form of bioenhancement. I'm not asking for any superpower of any sort. I'm just asking to live to be 110 and feel like I'm 50.
Yeah, that's also one of the possible outcomes of the superhuman era. And in the end, you also wrote a book in which you discussed about the apocalypse, as I should summarize it. But in the end, are you positive about the future of mankind?
I would say I'm less negative than I used to be, because I see tremendous potential for good or for ill in every one of us. And when you look at history, you can read it through two different lenses. One, a pessimistic one. Oh, look how awful we are. Look at all the repeating cycles of war and brutality and exploitation and oppression. But you can also read it in a different light that says, actually, certain values have been gradually coming to be asserted more. Humaneness, dignity, respect, kindness, nonviolence. Those are real options. So I'm not optimistic or pessimistic in the sense that I think that there's a fixed outcome waiting for us out there and it's either good or bad, because I come back to, it's up to us to make it what it's going to be. But I do think I'm more optimistic about the resources within us to make the right choices. Although it's equally within our power to make terrible choices that lead to apocalypse.
And Michael, we covered a lot of ground. Did we miss something you want to address?
No, I think we pretty much covered it all in 1 hour.
Yeah, we can talk on for a couple of hours, but I'm respectful of your time. Of course, I will lead people, or I will link to your book in the show notes. And I'm also looking forward to your new book. Hopefully, it's also going to be published in Europe.
Hopefully.
Yeah. How can people know more about you or get into touch with you? Or are you on social media, for example?
No, I avoid social media like the plague. Because it just sucks my time, and so I can't do anything if I do social media. The simplest thing is to Google my name, Michael Bess, and of the 10 first entries that show up on Google, I'm 9 of them. And it can take you to my website. You can email me. You can find, it's very easy to get in touch with me via email.
Great. And do you have any plans to go do a visit to Europe anytime soon? Maybe give lectures or?
I am planning on coming to Europe. My daughter's going to be doing a Fulbright scholarship in Spain this coming year, in Galicia.
Mm.
So I'm eager to come. I'm going to come visit her, and of course, I'll be in Europe. I'll be traveling around, maybe go see relatives in Italy, see friends in France. And if I get to come to Amsterdam, which is one of my favorite cities, I will definitely come to Amsterdam.
All right. That I'm looking forward to that. With that, I want to thank you a lot for this interview.
My pleasure.